Yes. Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, on this nomination, the ayes are 72, the nays are 16, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the President shall be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate shall resume legislative session.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to count number 38S782.
Without objection. Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to count number 38 as 782, a bill to amend the Public Works and Economic Development Act of 1965 to reauthorize that act and for other purposes.
I have a cloture motion at the desk. I ask that it be reported.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 38 as 782, a bill to amend the Public Works and Economic Development Act of 1965 to reauthorize that act and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators as follows: Reed of Nevada, Boxer, Conrad, Kerry, Whitehouse, Klobuchar, Cardin, Bingaman, Merkley, Murray, Menendez, Shaheen, Sanders, Lautenberg, Reed of Rhode Island, Durbin, Akaka.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum under Rule 22 be waived.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes the business day, it adjourn until 10:30 a.m. on Tuesday, June 7th. Following the prayer and the pledge, journal proceedings be approved to date. Morning hour be deemed expired. Time for the two leaders be reserved for use later in the day.
Without objection.
And following any leader remarks, the Senate proceed to a period of morning business for up to 1 hour. The senators are permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or the designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half, the majority controlling the final half. And following morning business, the Senate resumed consideration of the motion to proceed to S-782, the Economic Development Act. Further, that the Senate recess from 12:30 p.m. until 2:15 p.m. to allow for weekly caucus meetings.
Without objection.
Mr. President, tonight I filed cloture on the motion to proceed to S-782, the Economic Development Act. I hope that it's not necessary that we vote to invoke cloture on this matter on Wednesday. I hope we can get to it tomorrow. That cloture vote, if we can't move to it under consent, then we'll have a vote Monday morning. If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Brown of Ohio.
Without objection. Aye.
Over the last couple of weeks, I've traveled to senior senators from Toledo to Youngstown to Columbus to talk with seniors and health professionals about the threat facing their Medicare benefits. We owe it, first of all, Mr. President, we owe it to our children, we owe it to our grandchildren, we owe it to succeeding generations to reduce our nation's deficit. We know a decade ago, almost exactly a decade ago, we had the largest deficit, or the largest budget surplus in the history of our country. We know during the next 8 years, as Congress and President Bush cut taxes mostly on the wealthy in 2001 and 3, began 2 wars with Iraq and Afghanistan and didn't pay for them, did a prescription drug benefit, supposed benefit, that was in many ways a bailout for the drug and insurance companies and didn't pay for it, and deregulated Wall Street. During those 8 years, we had the largest budget deficit in American history, from the largest budget surplus in American history to the largest budget deficit in American history. Now, what we see in the Republican budget now as we talk about Medicare, and as they talk about Medicare, ending Medicare as we know it, turning Medicare over to the insurance companies, what we're seeing is Sort of the same old game, the same old song from people who don't much like Medicare. That is, cut taxes on the wealthy again and pay for those tax cuts. You've got to find a way to pay for them, I guess. Pay for those tax cuts by cutting Medicare, cutting the Medicare benefits that seniors have earned. That's what's troubling to me about this Republican budget. Too many Americans are facing a middle-class squeeze, working hard, playing by the rules, finding it hard, still hard to get ahead in this economy. Many parents, many Americans in their 40s and 50s and 60s are part of a sandwich generation. They're helping out their parents as their medical costs go up, and their parents aren't earning very much. They're maybe getting Social Security, something else maybe, and they're trying to pay for their children's college. So this is the wrong time, as if there would ever be a right time to turn Medicare over to the insurance industry and Medicare as we know it. That's why Senators Cardin from Maryland, McCaskill, Missouri, Tester from Montana, and I wrote a letter to the Vice President calling for the Republican plan to end Medicare as we know it to be taken off the table during the budget deficit reductions, during the deficit reduction negotiations. I want to see our deficit reduced. I want to see us have a long-term plan to get our budget deficit under control, the way we did in the 1990s and turned budget problems inherited by President Clinton, bequeathed by Presidents Reagan and Bush, inherited by President Clinton, how we got from a budget deficit to a budget surplus. Now, the statistics behind the success of Medicare are clear. The number of seniors lifted out of poverty in these 45 years, the number of families that have the help to care for a parent or grandparent. We simply can't reverse those gains to the ultimate form of rationing health care for seniors. Make no mistake, this is rationing health care. When you shift the costs, you give senior citizens a voucher, is the term they use. Basically, you give them $8,000 check, more or less, and that check goes to insurance companies to pay for health insurance. If it runs short, what happens? And it likely will for many seniors. They pay out of pocket. So that really is rationing, because if you're not a fairly wealthy senior and you run out of your Medicare, you run out of this privatized Medicare voucher, you're reaching into your pockets, Mr. President, and paying for it. That's rationing, because many seniors won't be able to pay for it. When I hear this term death panels and rationing and all these things that conservative politicians, usually enthralled in the insurance industry, are telling this chamber in the Senate and down the hall in the House of Representatives, I know what real rationing is. Real rationing is when seniors can't afford to pay out of pocket for their health insurance costs because of what this Republican budget plan does. Their plan calls for vouchers for private health coverage, doubling their out-of-pocket costs in the first year alone. The average senior would receive $8,000 voucher. However, in that first year of the voucher program, out-of-pocket expenses would, according to the Congressional Budget Office, not a Democratic group, not a Republican group, a down-the-middle group, Congressional Budget Office said seniors' out-of-pocket expenses would double to more than $12,500 annually. And as I said, at the same time, Republicans are going to take these savings to the budget, the cuts to senior care, through Medicare, take those savings and finance tax cuts to those people who earn 10 times or more the average retirement income for a Medicare recipient. Seniors would see their prescription drug costs explode. We, in the health care bill, cut the cost of prescription drugs for those seniors that are in the coverage gap, the so-called donut hole, cut them in half. That would go away. In other words, the Republican budget plan in my state, across the river from the presiding officer's state, would hand an $89 million prescription drug bill, tab, to split among 139,000 Ohio seniors. So tens of thousands of Ohio seniors, thousands of West Virginia seniors, tens of thousands of seniors in the system majority leader state of Illinois would be paying tens of millions of dollars in higher drug costs as a result of the Republican budget bill. The Senate voted that bill down, largely along party lines. Republicans continue to want to privatize Medicare, to turn Medicare over to the insurance industry. It would simply put insurance companies in charge of Medicare. It put insurance companies in making decisions about the health of our seniors. Is that what we want? That's why we had Medicare in 1965, because insurance companies were in charge of health care for seniors, meaning a lot of senior citizens in this country simply didn't have health care. Half of seniors had no health insurance, people over 65, in the year 1965. Now, 99% roughly of seniors have health insurance. That's because of this program that most of us dearly love, and the huge majority of our constituents constituents in West Virginia and Illinois and Ohio love, and that's called Medicare. Now, Mr. President, take all of what I said aside for a moment. Forget about vouchers, forget about privatization, forget about insurance companies even, and just think in a personal way what Medicare has done in this country. Medicare was created in 1965, passed mostly by Democrats in the House and Senate, signed by President Lyndon Johnson in July of 1965. We've had Medicare for 45 years. Think about what it's done. People, forget all the academic, forget all the policy questions. What Medicare has done is it's helped people in this country live longer, healthier lives. And what that means is that people have been able to get to know their grandchildren. Somebody that's 65 or 70 or 75 or 80 and enjoys generally good health has had years, maybe decades, with helping to raise a grandchild, getting to know their granddaughter, getting to play with their grandson, all the things that grandparents want to do. Because of Medicare, because senior citizens have had good quality, better quality of life because of something we call Medicare, they've gotten to know their grandparents better. Or they've gotten to know their grandchildren better. And think what that means to children. They have gotten to know their grandparents better and have gotten the kind of guidance that only grandparents can give. Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, said a few decades ago, she said, wisdom and knowledge are passed from grandparent to grandchild. Think about that. Wisdom and knowledge are passed from grandparent to grandchild because we all know if we have children, our kids don't always listen to us, but our grandchildren do. I have a 3-year-old grandson named Clayton, lives in Columbus, Ohio. And my wife, when I'm in Washington, sometimes picks him up. A lot of days I'll pick him up after school. We don't live in Columbus, but she goes down there, I'll pick him up after school. Every day Clayton gets to spend with his grandmother, and when I'm home with his grandfather, when I go home every weekend and get to see Clayton, not as often as I want, but fairly often, what Margaret Mead said is right, that grandparents impart a special knowledge and wisdom to grandchildren. And you think of the benefit that grandchildren have because of their grandparents. And I would have looked at it quite the same way until I had my first grandson 3 years ago. But I understand that now. And that's, to me, the real beauty of Medicare. Medicare has helped this country's seniors live longer, healthier lives. It has helped this country's children be raised in a way, in a moral way, in a practical way, in an educational way, better than they would have if their grandparents hadn't been around. That's the fundamental reason that when I hear Republicans say they want to change, we want to get rid of Medicare as we know it, they want to turn Medicare over in senior health care over to the insurance industry, we know what will happen. Seniors won't live longer, healthier lives because because they will have lost Medicare as we know it, Mr. President. And that's why we sent the letter to Vice President Biden, what Senator Tester and McCaskill and Cardin, Senators Tester, McCaskill, and Cardin and I did, to say, take Medicare off the table. Let's talk. We need to deal with this budget deficit, but don't mess with Medicare while we're doing it. It's pretty simple, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to speak for the next 10 minutes in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, later this week we're going to consider an issue which is complicated. But it's an issue that affects every single American that ever takes a piece of plastic and pays for anything, at a hotel, at a restaurant, at a convenience store, tuition at a school, a charitable deduction to Red Cross in the midst of a disaster. If you use plastic, every time that debit card, and we're talking just about debit cards for this conversation, every time that debit card is swiped, there's a fee that goes to the bank that issued the card. And you think to yourself, well, I wonder how they negotiate those fees. And the answer is they don't. What happens is the credit card companies, the two giants, Visa and MasterCard, working through the issuing banks, determine what's going to be charged every time you swipe the card. So, what does a local grocery store have to say about it? Nothing. Their alternative is to not accept plastic at all. Visa and MasterCard say, you want to use our cards, you play by our rules, and our rules will tell you how much we take every time you swipe the card. I've seen it happen, you have too, where you go into a store and you shake your head because that young person in front of you just bought a candy bar and is using a piece of plastic to pay for it. And you think to yourself, why don't they reach in their pocket and pull out a dollar bill and pay for it? Instead, they swipe the card. And you know what happens? That person selling that candy bar just lost money. Because the folks at the bank and the credit card companies are going to get that swipe fee. which happens to be more than the profit that that little grocery store is going to make on a candy bar. So naturally, retailers and merchants all across America have said, this isn't fair to us. We have no negotiating power when it comes to how much is taken out each time there's a plastic transaction for debit cards, and the consumers don't know. We know as retailers, but the consumers don't even know. There is no transparency, there is no competition. Well, what's wrong with this picture? If you believe in a free market, you believe in those two things, you ought to believe there'd be some competition, so maybe there'd be one debit card company that charges a lower fee. Maybe there would be special consideration given if somebody paid in cash. I guess this dates me, but there was a time when people paid in cash for almost everything, except when they used a check, and that was rare. And when they processed the check, it was pennies. Right now, what the Federal Reserve tells us is that for each and every debit card transaction, the average fee charged is 44 cents. When we passed an amendment here last year, we said to the Federal Reserve, well, what's the actual cost to the company, the issuing bank and the credit card, debit card company, for processing this transaction? They said 10 or 12 cents, and they're charging over 40 cents on each transaction. Who pays it? We all pay it. Even if you walk into a store to pay cash, that merchant has put a price on that good that considers the fact that most people are using plastic, so they have to raise that price to cover that fee. So we said to the Federal Reserve, sit down and figure out what's reasonable and proportional in terms of the cost that should be collected every time you swipe the fee. Well, this is a big political issue, one of the biggest. You might say it's a multi-billion-dollar issue, and it is, because each month in America, over $1.3 billion, $1.3 billion is collected from customers all across America when they swipe their debit cards. And where does the money go? Most of it goes to the biggest banks on Wall Street. The same banks that were just moaning and groaning a few years ago about they needed a bailout because they made some big mistakes, they're back again. They want a bailout when it comes to these debit cards. They want to be able to continue to collect 40 cents and more on every transaction. Well, we passed a law that said the party's over. Starting July 21st, there'll be a new rule that will establish a reasonable fee. And they have been fighting this with all of their might. All of their lobbyists, all of their workers, all the letters they can send against this reform. Why? Because it involves money, huge amounts of money for these major Wall Street banks and credit card companies. Well, we've got to bring an end to this. The consumer groups across America, labor groups, even some small business groups, retail federation, merchants, saloon keepers, hotel owners, restaurant owners, convenience store owners all across America have said we've got to quit this. This isn't fair to us and to our customers. Let us have a reasonable amount charged for what's actually taking place with the debit card, and we can live with it. But 4 times as much they're charging today? And incidentally, go up to Canada. Not a lot different than the United States. Debit cards and credit cards there issued by banks. You know what the interchange fee is charged in Canada today? 0. No charge. No charge at all to the merchant who takes a debit card in Canada. The same companies, Visa and MasterCard, charge 0 in Canada and 40 cents in the United States. Aren't we blessed to have 2 great credit card companies who've dreamed up how to stick it to American consumers at the benefit of American banks, on Wall Street particularly? That's what this is about. Now, most of my colleagues have gone home over the last week or two, and they've heard about this issue because it means a lot to a lot of people. What we did was exempt in this law credit unions and community banks. Some people said, why'd you exempt them? Why shouldn't they have reduced fees too? Well, we want to make sure that financially they are not disadvantaged by this. And we put in a specific exemption and said to the Federal Reserve, write up your rule to protect them. I have said on the floor, and I'll say it again, if at the end of the day the rule from the Federal Reserve does not provide adequate protection for credit unions and community banks, I am ready to sign up today to put in even more protection in the law. I'll be there. I want to make sure they understand They were exempted because I believe they should be, and I want to make sure that exemption works. But I don't care what happens to the Wall Street banks. I don't care what happens to these credit card companies. They seem to end up on their feet when it's all over anyway. After giving them billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to bail them out of their mess that they made of things in this recession, what did they do? They sent us a big wet kiss in the form of multi-million-dollar bonuses for all their officers, smiling all the way to the bank with taxpayers' money. We don't owe them a thing. And the members who will come to the floor this week and vote with those big banks and those credit card companies really have to ask themselves, when are you ever going to stand up for consumers and retailers and merchants and small businesses across America? Is somebody going to speak up for them in this chamber? That's what this debate is about. And I hope at the end of the day that my colleagues will stand tall and say no to Wall Street, no to the credit card companies, that they'll stand by the retailers and the merchants to give them a chance for transparency and competition, to give them a chance for a reasonable fee for what is actually transpiring in this transaction. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until 10:30 tomorrow, Tuesday a.m.
The Senate today working on the confirmation of a new Solicitor General. The position hasn't been permanently filled since Elena Kagan became the latest Supreme Court justice.